So tonight's speaker is Nancy Trask. She grew up in Winterset, Iowa, and she has been the director of the Winterset Public Library for the last 10 years. She's worked in public and academic libraries in Oklahoma, Texas, Massachusetts, and New York. She has a lifelong interest in the Institute of Cultural Affairs, the ICA, and is currently on their National Board of Directors. She's worked with the ICA for over 15 years on community development projects, including 4 years in the villages of India. Nancy's interest in World War II is enhanced by conversations she had with her 100-year-old father, who is a Purple Heart veteran of Normandy. Please help me welcome Nancy.
Thank you all. Thank you for the warm welcome. They say if you get applause on your way to the podium, they haven't even heard you yet, then you've got that audience just wrapped around your little finger. Well, it's great to be here in Iowa City. I did not realize the parking issues that would be here, so I was in a little bit of trouble getting in. So, how many people have seen the Monuments Men movie? How many have read the book? I told you this was mine. How many have read the book again? Okay. And how many in here have traveled in Europe? This is the pop quiz at the beginning. How many here are history students? How many here are history professors? I'm scared to death of this. Okay, well, I can say whatever I say, and then, you can look it up afterward and verify. So George Stout was born in Winterset, Iowa in 1897. His granddad was Micaiah Stout, had been in the Civil War, and after the Civil War brought his family to Winterset. And the newspaper said that he was ill for, I'm assuming maybe he got injured in the war and then he was ill for the rest of his days. His son then was Abraham Lincoln Stout, George's dad, who was born and raised in Winterset, married a Madison County girl as well, and they raised their 6 sons in Winterset. George was the oldest of the 6 sons. And I think George took after his dad. You'll see what I mean, because his dad was a banker, an alderman, that's the old word for city council, school board member, nearly every position in the church. He was also a volunteer fireman. So he just did everything in town, quite a great citizen. And if you go out to the Winterset Cemetery, you'll see that the grandparents, the parents, and one little brother are all buried there in the Winterset Cemetery. These days I've done so much research on him, I just feel like that's holy ground out there. Of course it is anyway, but you get out there, you learn a little more about the people, and it's rather moving. So his nickname was Stouty at Winterset High School. Now I don't like that, I wouldn't like that as my nickname. But some of the other nicknames here are pretty bad too. I mean, Biddy and Turk, so I guess Stouty's not too bad. So George Stout was in the Equitian Society. Anybody ever heard that word before? It's a literary thing, I understand. And he was also business manager of the Megaphone, this 1915 publication of the high school annual. It was called the Megaphone at the time. And he also contributed cartoons to the Megaphone. And I love the little underneath the shoe. I love his little signature under there. And just the sense of humor that he had and showed in these great little cartoons. And then on this one, I love the F in football on that cartoon. Isn't that the most cutest thing? Just creative. Okay, back here a second. And then you'll notice, if I can find my, here it is. Whoop, did that again, sorry. You'll be very familiar with that slide. Stout here being the quarter, which I take it to be the quarterback of the team. So he was in everything too. Football, basketball, track, W Club, orchestra. He became the YMCA president of the high school YMCA. And in the newspaper, we just digitized a little less than a year ago. And so you can look up George Stout by a word search. It's very cool. And I learned that when he became YMCA president there at the high school that he started a campaign, a ribbon campaign, that was against smut and some other things like that. So I think what a straight up guy this was. He was politically correct and knew what he was about, I guess. His early interests were very much in journalism and theater, and from Winterset High School went off to Grinnell College for 2 years. And then 2 years overseas during World War I. He was in the medical corps, but also entertaining the troops in a production called the Khaki Carnival. I haven't been able to find out whether he was in a play, like acting, or whether he was playing his instrument or what he was doing in that. But that would be interesting. Then over to here, Iowa City, 1919 through 1921, when he got his bachelor's degree in art. And in about 1920 is when his dad died. So his dad died when the kids were all pretty young, and his mom moved those 5 other brothers to Iowa City, and they lived here then. And I thought, what a nice strategic idea to do that, because she got that near George, for one thing, so he could have his good influence on the other boys. And then also just be in a university town. They could live at home and go to school and save a little money that way, you know. So in the summer of 1920, he was acting in a Chautauqua play, It Pays to Advertise. And the Iowa City Press Citizen said, George Stout is among the university's best amateur actors. And he was in the Des Moines papers and in the Iowa City Press Citizen on numerous occasions. And at one point, one of the newspapers said that George Stout is very well known here in Des Moines. And I thought, gee whiz, when I was a college kid, was I well known even in that college town, or let alone in the next town over? So he was in a lot of productions, and evidently his name went out there as being a good actor. So here he is as a junior in the is the annual called the Hawkeye or what? Probably, okay, so in the Hawkeye. He was the managing editor of the Hawkeye in other clubs, and I just have to think that with his 5 younger brothers, lost his dad, lots of high school activities, 2 years at Grinnell College, 2 years in the Medical Corps in World War I, what adult character and leadership he already had started building up at quite a young age. Well, he'd met Margaret Hayes in his art classes, and they were interested in each other. She was the daughter of a law professor here. And so they both started teaching in the art department, and I think some other universities as well. I think she went over to Omaha for a while. And so they were teaching art at the college level. And then, notice the newspaper, newlyweds to study art in Paris a year. So he evidently popped the question and said, do you want to go study art in Paris with me for a year? And I hate to repeat what I did last night, but I just can't avoid going back to this slide and saying, you know, if this guy that looked like that had asked me to get married and go study art for a year in Paris, you know, what would my answer be? I'm thinking I'd be pretty positive about that. Although he did mention that, where did I read that? One of his comments was that in order to get into a good, quote, good art school, that it helped to have been to Europe and study art for a year. And I guess he had his sights on Harvard, because then he did go to Harvard to get his master's degree in art. So, well, throughout the 30s, George Stout was employed at the Fogg Art Museum on the Harvard campus. I think that's the oldest art museum there. And became the head of the conservation department there. And he was busy methodically developing the modern scientific principles of art conservation. He wrote several textbooks, including one that's somewhat like an encyclopedia, about how to conserve and preserve artworks. And those textbooks still being used in some of the colleges as, you know, as the authoritative text. I love to ask this in libraries. Does anybody recognize what this is? Go back a few years like I do. So on the Harvard campus, he had found a card catalog. And year after year, he went back to his card catalog, which he had stuck all sorts of painting materials in. So I suppose paints, gessos, glues, canvases, I can't imagine what all he had in there, but he'd go back to it and document what was happening in the degradation process. And I suppose he would apply different processes to canvas and stick them in those little drawers. So I think that's what caused Robert Edsel to describe, well, Robert Edsel is the author of the book, the Monuments Men book, described him as very, very patient. But he also described him as meticulous, unflappable, brilliant, dapper. He said the word dapper almost every time he said the word George Stout. debonair, punctual, and precise. His professional motto was actually first conduct your analysis and then make your decision. Very sensible. And so Rutherford Gettens was another student along the same time when George Stout was getting his master's. And once Stout was in the conservation department at the Fogg Museum, then he hired Rutherford Gettens, and they were a team working on these principles of art preservation. So they designed a hypodermic needle, and they called it the microsectioner, that they could take little bits of samples out of paintings and figure out how they were structured, and therefore, you know, scientifically what to do about different conditions. But they said, the historians said, that what really put the Fogg Museum on the map was the result of Stout and Gettens piecing together and stabilizing an early Buddhist mud wall painting. Next time I'm going to ask a volunteer to read that phrase. That had been acquired in pieces by several museums. And because they, quote, felt accountable to future generations, they had scrupulously documented their work. And this became quite a driving force then for improving documentation in other museums. There's a conservation expert named Jerry Podaney who said that imagining the profession without Mr. Stout's input is like asking where doctors would be if they hadn't started looking at biology and anatomy. So Stout came in at the ground level and really built up that science. I am theorizing that at this point, George Stout was probably considered the most highly regarded expert on art and archive preservation in America because the Japanese then attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States government had to think quick, what are we going to do to protect our Constitution and Declaration of Independence? They took them to Fort Knox. And in the moving, they realized that some of the corners were turned down, like some people do to our library books, that some Scotch tape had been used on some of the papers, and there was gummy stuff that needed to be removed, corners needed to be reattached, and etc. So, of course, under great secrecy, he and a Harvard colleague, Evelyn Ehrlich, traveled to Fort Knox, and they mended those documents. So I did see a newspaper article that came out a few years later, and it mentioned that. Of course, at the time, it was too secret of a deal, but a few years later, there was a paper that said that the documents had been deemed good for another few hundred years. I hope so. Well, world politics, of course, was becoming less and less stable, and George Stout's plan was that we needed to be ready to go into a wartime situation. He'd already seen what happened in World War I, so he knew what it was like. And he wanted there to be people on the ground available to go onto the ground of war to be able to preserve the culture and the artworks and etc. And he was taking his plan to all the museum directors and even to London to get support for this plan. But of course, just think of the poor US government trying to crank up a war machine and get ready for war. They really weren't thinking, okay, well, first of all, let's protect the art, and then let's get some tanks and some soldiers and et cetera. So it just delayed the whole thing, of course. Things happened the way they happened. But this Western Union telegram is an invitation to the museum directors to all get together for a meeting, and this happened just several days, 5 days after Pearl Harbor had happened. So they were really getting more serious about this plan and trying to get it put into place. And thankfully, eventually, President Roosevelt recognized the importance of this, and he appointed a commission called the Roberts Commission to take charge. And they basically used George Stout's plan, and then formed this section of soldiers called the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Subcommission or group or whatever. And Stout, by this point, was 45 years old. A lot of the other monuments men were also mid-career and midlife like this. He and his wife had 2 sons, 10 years old, around 10, and 18 years old. The 18-year-old was getting ready to go into the service as well. And Stout really wasn't available. He didn't have the patience to stick around and see what was going to happen with this Roberts Commission. He'd already volunteered back into active duty in the Navy, which he'd been in World War I, and was out testing camouflage for aircraft. And he was happy with that job, and he thought he would continue that. But the Roberts Commission reached out to him, and they nabbed him up, put him into the Monuments Men, or the MFAA. And he was one of the first officers then to go into Normandy. And in fact, a few months later, he was appointed as lieutenant commander of the Monuments Men. And I just have to think that this guy right here, I think he looks like he stepped out of a movie in that particular shot. So there are really a lot of choice photographs of the guys. So 9 officers and several administrators were assigned to protect all of the art in Europe. So where would you start? Quite a big charge. And well, you can just imagine the difficulty of working in the midst of war. In the movie, it makes it look like these guys were able to get together and work together, but in fact, they were far distant from each other. They each had their own objectives. That one was assigned to the 3rd Army, one was assigned to the 12th Army, etc. Well, even, let's see, James Rorimer in his book, which he wrote immediately after the war, he was reflecting that it was difficult to get down to the business of art because his superior officers, they were urgent to get other things done, and they kept assigning him to do other things, of which he just felt that he had to do. So eventually, though, he did get started on his art conservation. He's the guy who was played by Matt Damon in the movie. So none of them were assigned transportation. This was a really tough lick for them, and they needed radios, they needed cameras, etc. Packing materials. It was just pretty tough to scrounge for the stuff that they really needed. And I have to think, after seeing the Patton movie, has everybody seen that Patton movie quite a few years ago? And they say that was quite a realistic portrayal of General Patton, at least his public personality. And can you think of trying to slow him down to save a monument here or a library there? Not much. This is Thomas Carr Howe Jr. He wrote a book called Salt Mines and Castles just after the war. That's actually available in reprint if you want to get it. I did get it for the library in Winterset. So a couple of good quotes from him. The Roberts Commission had played in luck when they got George Stout. Of course, he was an obvious choice, tops in his field, the technical care and preservation of pictures. He was known and respected throughout the world for his brilliant research work at Harvard, where he presided over the Fogg Museum. And then I love this quote: "We found George at the top floor of a dingy building in the center of the town. I hadn't seen him for 15 years, but he hadn't changed. His face was a healthy brown, his eyes were as keen, and his teeth as dazzlingly white as ever. George was in his middle 40s. His oldest boy was in the Navy, but George didn't look a day over 30. That's our Winterset boy. We can claim him as an Iowan Midwesterner. So the Monuments Men, once they got into Europe, they ended up with a couple of different missions. First of all, what they thought they were coming to do was to warn the different Allied troops, go and talk officer to officer and say, hey, there's a university ahead, there's an important monument ahead, a cathedral or whatever, and persuade them to not bomb in that area, if at all possible, on military terms. So if the worst had already happened, like this building here, they thought at least they could rope this off and prevent further looting of the area, show the local people how to best deal with, try to help in a helpful way. And fortunately, there were orders from General Eisenhower to all of the troops that were very supportive of this. He said in his orders, if you have to bomb something that's important, then of course, militarily speaking, you have to do what you have to do. But there are many times when that is not the case, and therefore don't go where you don't have to go. So that was helpful. Second mission came to light rather soon. They realized that artworks were being stolen by the Nazis by the truckloads, the ambulance loads. the train loads. And there's another movie that came out maybe in the late 60s, I don't exactly know when, starring Burt Lancaster, called The Train. Anybody seen that one? And it was about the French resistance who managed to get one of these trains full of artworks and just not let it get where it was supposed to be going for a month until the end of the war. And then that train never did go where it was supposed to go for the Nazis. So at any rate, so that became a huge mission because there were about 1,500 little hidey holes, various salt mines and castles and et cetera, where these things were being held. And of course it was high secret of where they were and how to get them back. So they had plenty on their hands with this second mission. They had to interview all these Nazis. You know, that wasn't easy. They didn't want to give the information, of course. They had to improvise with packing materials and transportation. They were working near the front as they could, and people lost their lives. Some of the monuments men lost their lives in this work. They portrayed that in the movie, actually. I think a French guy was killed in action. There wasn't actually a French monuments men, but there were a few people who were killed in the line of action. And then the additional pressures really pressurized situation on these two counts, and that is that the Nazis had issued an order saying, well, Hitler had issued an order called the Nero Decree, which said, if you have to retreat, don't leave anything behind. Blow all the factories, blow all the bridges, etc. So that was pretty tough conditions. And also, of course, you've got your Eastern Front and your Western Front during World War II in Europe, and U.S. and British were coming in from the Western Front. From the Eastern Front was coming the Russians. The Russians, of course, were our ally, and they had contributed 25 million lives they lost in this war. It was humongous. And their thought was, if they found stuff, consider that looted, because they felt that that should come to help rebuild their country. You know, they'd lost all these lives to the war effort, so they felt that they deserved to take what they could find. Well, here you have Hitler and Goehring. I hate it when I get to this set of slides because I just feel like reaching up there with my magic marker and putting big frowns on their faces instead of smirks, but here's from a Goehring speech. He said, "It seemed to me to be a relatively simple matter in former days. It used to be called plundering. It was up to the party in question to carry off what had been conquered. But today, things have become more humane. In spite of that, I intend to plunder and to do it thoroughly." That one kills me. And then this, on the right-hand side, is a description of Hitler's Nero Decree. It was actually called the Demolitions on Reich Territory Order. And it just said, blow everything up. Well, fortunately for the world and the future, there were several Nazis who had a good degree of power, especially this Albert Speer, who I think was Hitler's architect, if I remember correctly, who did not believe that that should happen. And so they managed to spare some of the things that would have otherwise gotten blown up. Well, my title was Institutionalized Plundering, and here's the stamp that appeared on the back of the paintings that were stolen by the Nazis. It was like a part of the government. You go steal paintings from Jewish residences and museums, stamp them on the back that you did it, and then take it, sort them out for who gets the booty, and move onward. Picture of Hitler again. And I guess he was a frustrated art student. He thought he was quite the artist. I've seen pictures of some of his paintings. I thought they looked pretty good myself, but he applied twice to art school in Vienna, which I think was like a advanced education there in Vienna, and was denied admission both times. So if we could rewrite history, we should see if we could get him into art school. Maybe we could avoid what happened. That might make a good TV show or something. So this was his model of his vision for the 1,000-year legacy that he would leave. The Führer's Museum at his hometown in Linz, Austria, which I think is probably museums and universities and libraries and et cetera, that would all be the best in the world. In fact, you know, I read a book called The Zookeeper's Wife, and it was about Poland, a nonfiction book about Poland, and the people stole the animals from the zoo. The Nazis had stolen the animals from these people's zoo. And these people were just unstoppable. They continued to go into the Jewish ghetto and to take food in and medical supplies in and to try to seek people, get them out. And they could, well, they used their zoo to hide people after they lost their animals to the Nazis. So they would take anything, church bells, zoo animals, and I guess this would be the destination. Another picture of Hitler and Goehring on one of their, quote, shopping trips, possibly, quote, ownerless art, which has a bad ring to it, and probably it was ownerless art by that time. Well, Goehring's special castle that he took over for hiding French treasures was this Neuschwanstein Castle in Germany. And beautiful picture showing how mountainous that is. And I know you folks have been to that castle. Has anybody else been to that castle? I guess it's quite the tourist attraction. Did you get to go right through it, go in it and through it?
Not the whole thing.
Not the whole thing.
Huge castle. We got
Yeah.
into the dining hall, and we didn't get to climb any of the turrets.
That's 30 years ago.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so I mean, it is very mountainous, right? And the Allies, when they found out where this place was and went to empty the art treasures out, it was wintertime and icy, so they had a heck of a time getting trucks up and down those roads. But in there they discovered 21,000 items, including the Rothschild jewelry collection, which they counted as one item. So there was a lot of artwork in there, very valuable. This was part of the information that Rose Valland shared. Rose Valland being the Cate Blanchett person, and who had taken careful notes about everything she heard for 4 years in the Jeu de Paume. She was just a little volunteer there, and she kept getting fired. The Nazis kept saying, get out, you know, you'll lose your life, all this stuff, and she just kept coming back day after day, and she spoke excellent German and took lots and lots of notes. So that helped in the recovery of a lot of artworks. Here are pictures of the Allies bringing the loot out of the castle, and right here is James Rorimer. He's the Matt Damon character that we know of. And of course it was a miserable 4 years, you know, in France, being occupied by Germany that long. And the director of the French National Museums had his plan, and that was to keep everything on the move. If you moved it around, maybe the Nazis wouldn't get to it. And so they emptied the Louvre, they sent it out to various chateaus and moved it around various times. The Mona Lisa was moved 6 times. The first time to a place of too high of an altitude, and it was hard on the picture. They had to move it again real quick to get it out of those conditions. Here's the Venus de Milo all roped up and ready to get moved. Sad picture here, the empty Louvre. But the Louvre didn't stay empty for long. They filled it up with the stolen artworks, and they used that as a sorting station to sort through and say, okay, this will go to Goehring's stuff, this will go to Hitler's, and so. Here's Rose Valland, and she was just kind of a mousy little woman. I think these are a couple of great pictures of her. She obviously had a lot of guts and a lot of willpower and initiative to do that work that she did and just keep her mouth closed, and the Nazis never did know that she spoke German in there all that time and was listening very carefully, going home at night and taking lots of notes down. Credited with saving 60,000 pieces of art. So another hiding place, salt mines were very popular, and the first one is this Altaussee salt mine. Well, Captain Posey got a toothache, and he told his private that worked with him. He said, I got to get a dentist appointment. So Kirstein found a dentist. They went, and once they got there, that dentist just blabbed and blabbed about an art expert, his son-in-law, who was a fabulous art expert. So they got to thinking about this after they left the appointment, and so they decided to go see him and see what was what with that story. And they went out to his chateau out in the middle of nowhere. It sounded like it was remote anyway. And he told them the location of the Neuschwanstein Castle as well as this Altaussee salt mine. And they did send back and have him arrested. Nice to know some people came to justice, right? Here's Stout in the middle coming out of that salt mine. And the author of the Monuments Men book, Robert Edsel, excuse me, whoops, don't hit your microphone. His theory is that the stuff in that mine was saved by the local miners because they had found out and about there these 8 huge bombs that were, supposedly they were inside the salt mine and were supposed to be set off. But somebody rolled them out. Somebody set little explosives at the doorways to those mine shafts. And Edsel's theory is that it was these local miners, which would really make sense. They would want their natural resource to be able to have jobs in the future and all. So this was Hitler's big storehouse. And once Posey and the other guys with him found so much art in that mine, they said, well, we've got to call in an expert. And Kirstein said, the expert is always George Stout, who is perhaps the nicest man in the world. Again, I'm thinking that's our Midwestern guy. In that salt mine, they found tons of paintings, sculptures, cases of archives, furniture, whole libraries of books. It's just unbelievable. Tapestries, carpets from people's homes, antique furniture from people's homes. Very tragic. And this was one of the scenarios where they only had 4 days to remove it all because the Soviet zone of occupation would soon be there to take charge. It took 80 truckloads to get it all out of there, including the Ghent Altarpiece and a Michelangelo statue, a big one. And this shows Stout with the N on his sweater there for Navy. With it looks like a couple of local Austrian miners, doesn't it? Or Austrians with the little peaked hats. And they are working on that Ghent altarpiece, which was stolen in both World War I and World War II by the Germans. They really want that piece of art. So you can see one small section here and some other sections of it back behind, but they're doing a little repair there as they go. Here's a picture of it opened out and then closed. A Jan van Eyck from the 15th century. A very important piece of art in the art world. Here's Stout getting this Madonna and child kind of wrapped up and roped up to go out. They had to create a pulley. Look what they're using for cushioning. Doesn't it just look like some old pillow or some old piece of curtain or something in there? Interesting. So once she was loaded up, one of the observers said that the statue was trussed up like a 2,000-pound ham, packed in sheepskin coats, paper and rope. Even a tiny scratch would be forever noticed by the world. And here's the Madonna and Child back in Belgium now. And of course, since 1972, these pieces are being more highly protected. Here are some Allied soldiers handling a Vermeer, the Astronomer. A little better picture of the Astronomer here. And this painting was returned to the Rothschild family after the war, but something came about with taxation and stuff, and it became the property of the government of France, so now it's on exhibit at the Louvre. All right, second salt mine. Are you ready to go? Here's the Merkers Salt Mine. This is in Germany. The other one was in Austria. And in April 1945, 4 of Patton's battalions had found this mine and all of its contents. 2,000 soldiers were on guard there. And all these are bags stacked upon other bags of gold, as far as you can see back in there. That's a lot of gold. So this was Germany's gold reserves, and also the plates for printing currency. And you know, this was a huge find. This could cut short the war. If they couldn't buy all the material that they needed, you know, this could cut short by months the war. So it ended up that there were 40 tons of artworks in there too. And it was a huge mine, 35 miles of tunnels, and it took 32 10-ton trucks with heavy military escort to get all that stuff out of there. The generals were very impressed by this find, and they came and took a tour of inspection themselves. So here you've got Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley right there, and I don't know who that fourth guy is back there. Anybody know him? We should probably know him, but I'm not sure who that is. And when Patton got into that elevator with the others, he looked up at a little rope that was in the elevator, and he says, if this clothesline snaps, promotions in the U.S. Army would be considerably stimulated. And Eyck said, that's enough, no more cracks till we're above ground again. I think it's scary going down into a mine. I went down into a gold mine in Colorado, and it was very dark, very scary. I didn't like that very well. Well, again, very tough working conditions for art, for the sake of the art. For one thing, again, the Russians were coming to be the occupiers there. Patton was dying to get out of there with his 4 battalions and get going. So they had 4 days again. They had to mix, each truck had to have some gold and some art, because the truck couldn't go with solid gold on it. It was just too heavy of a load. They had brought jeeps down into the mine to help, you know, bring the gold around, because it was so heavy, which, you know, they were having to breathe exhaust from the jeep. Stout had asked for his commander, who was a British guy, to be in charge of that evacuation, and General Patton wouldn't even allow the British guy into the mine at all. So it fell upon Stout to do this very impossible task. Sounded like just a total management nightmare, to think of having prisoners of war down there with all that gold and using them as your labor. And who's to prevent somebody? Everybody would want to stick a little piece of gold in their pocket, wouldn't they, and try to get out of there? So tough working conditions. Kirstein had found 1,000 sheepskin coats that was in another mine serving as the Luftwaffe uniform depot, so they did have those to pack the art in. But even that, you know, when you're trying to pack great artworks in coats, that might be a little tough too. They had sprayed water because of the corrosive nature of the salt, wanted to get that off the gold, and so they were walking around in water. And something that I do not do at my library job every day, and I would not like doing my work walking around in water. So they had found over $262 billion worth of gold. Unbelievable. And a German official who was there said that the currency that they had found, they really needed that to pay the German army. And Bradley is quoted as saying, I doubt that the German army will be meeting payrolls for much longer. And I'm glad of that. It was about done at that time. They worked on sorting out who should be given how much gold until 1998. They were still working on that. Unbelievable. And by that time, some of the countries had just decided their share could go ahead and go to compensate some of the victims. So, Manet's Wintergarten. Well, I'll comment on a salt dog, those little trains, you know, that were used to haul the salt up and out. And this is Walker Hancock, a famous sculptor. I'll show you a little bit more about him later. Well, the 3 generals then went to visit the Ohrdruf slave camp. This was the first camp to be liberated. They did find a few people alive amidst a lot of death there. And the staff that they took in there, it was extremely emotional kind of thing to go and see, of course. It would make anybody just feel ill and cry and et cetera. And reportedly General Patton got sick even. And some people had commented to General Eisenhower, I just can't go in there, I know I'll get sick. And he had said back to them, well, he had to go in as a personal witness in case somebody would ever claim that it was propaganda, which we know has happened. And talk about a nerve-wracking day, just highs and lows and very lows. The generals went onward together, they dined together, and at midnight they got the news that Roosevelt had passed away, so very rough day. Here's, I think that's Eisenhower. I guess that's just theoretical, but I think he's standing like Eisenhower would. And you can see why they were terribly upset to see this camp. Eisenhower and Patton required the local townspeople, the nearby town, to come and help clean up the camp. And then the mayor and his wife that evening went home and hung themselves. Well, here's a reminder of how many casualties were a factor in World War II. Estimated world total of 48 million, including the 6 million Jews. But I saw some estimates on the web as high as 72 million. Here's Stout, the fourth one over. Oh, is that this guy is Stout here. And here's another salt mine now, the Burnterode. And in there they found 400,000 tons of ammunitions. You know, they were using these salt mines as places as their factories for war material and et cetera. So, you know, they didn't want their bombs being bombed, so that was a safe place to work. But along with all this ammunitions depot, they recovered 271 paintings. They came across large coffins in there, which I take it were headed towards the Führer Museum for Hitler to be able to brag that he had these historic coffins. And it was Kaiser Friedrich and his father, who had been the kings of Prussia and were normally buried in Potsdam, right, just outside of Berlin at their palaces. But he had those caskets in there, and also the von Hindenburg family. You know, Paul von Hindenburg had been president of Germany right before Hitler took over. And von Hindenburg was a huge guy, 6'5". These were big caskets that they were having to move out of there. And I remember reading about how difficult it was to get those huge caskets on the elevator and get them up and out. Well, the Allies were just finding important artworks everywhere, including these heartbreaking finds, like these sapphire Torahs. Here this chaplain is standing hip deep in a room full of Torahs that had been taken from various synagogues. Here's Da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine, ready to go home, handling a Peter Paul Rubens. I think of my dad. My dad actually was hurt in St. Lo just right before he got to St. Lo. And then like 3 days after that, the Monuments Men were having this meeting in St. Lo. You probably remember that from the movie. There was a meeting in St. Lo. And I just think of my dad or any ordinary serviceman, and there's, okay, you take the Peter Paul Rubens and I'll take the Da Vinci and we'll get these out of here. Guarding the artworks. And then just to give a plug for the book, the Monuments Men book by Edsel. This story, it's just chock full of various stories, but this story is about Charles Parkhurst, another monuments man. He was riding in his Jeep, but he realized he couldn't go any further on the road. It was so bad he couldn't go in the Jeep. So he'd abandoned the Jeep. He was out walking through the forest to try to get to where he was going. And he came upon a group of people, and he kept getting closer to them, and he thought, well, they certainly are standing so still, and they're so quiet. And got up to it, and it was the Rodin sculpture, the Burghers of Calais. They had kind of a way station here for storing the art in this church, but actually they were headed towards these big institutions. And actually Rose Valland, she was asked at the end of the war, what do you want? Because she'd given so much through her time in France there. And she said, well, she really wanted to be commissioned into the French military. And she was awarded that commission and went into the military and then came I'm not sure which of these towns or whether she went to various of these collecting points, but she spent 10 years there sorting through art, trying to get it back to the right place. 5 to 20 million art pieces estimated stolen by the Nazis. Plus, of course, all of the other heartbreaking stuff. Somehow to see a whole room full of bells, you know, it breaks my heart to think every school that they, you know, how you have your precious things at the fire station, the school, the church, you know, and for somebody to take your bells, it's just too much for me. Even entire libraries of books, that infuriates me too as a librarian. So the monuments men recovered and returned about 5 million. And as the treasures started going home, it was a big uplift to these countries. It hit the newspapers and all. Here's a little reminder of the different European nations occupied by Nazi Germany. Just kind of takes your breath away today as you think of the different cultures in all these nations and somebody messing with all of them. Well, at this point, Stout left Europe for a 2-month leave. He was 47 years old by that time. He'd helped to organize the effort. Whoopsie, I'll go back to that slide. He had pushed for expansion of the effort. He had mentored the other guys because a lot of them are architects or various occupations, university professors, museum directors, but they didn't have his preservation and conservation knowledge. He'd interrogated Nazi officials. He had found this old Volkswagen, and he'd appropriated that somehow. I wish they had elaborated on that in the book or the movie, but at any rate, he'd found this thing. He'd evidently put 50,000 miles on it, so he'd made a lot of tracks. And rescuing all that gold was very significant. Well, he spent 2 months with his family, and then he took off for Japan to do the similar type of work there. And then after the war, came back home. Back to his family, back to the world of museums. And first he went straight back to the Fogg Museum, but shortly went to, as director to the Worcester Art Museum, which would be in Massachusetts. And one of his colleagues at Worcester said he rarely talked about those exciting times or his heroic accomplishments. I do not remember Mr. Stout as a flashy personality. You can look him up on the web and get to a couple of vocal pieces and hear his voice. One is This I Believe. Does anybody remember the series called This I Believe? And for a guy who has seen both world wars up close and personal, to give the kind of positive message that he gave in that transcript is just unbelievable. It's really worth looking at it. Got to get on your Google. After that, then he became the director for his final 15 years of professional life of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum there in Boston. I love this courtyard. I like to think, well, he got a great reward in the end. He got to be in beautiful surroundings. And this tile on the floor here, here's a better picture of it from above. I learned from his granddaughter, or actually his granddaughter's husband, stories that they had gone to this museum and they'd just been treated like royalty, you know, once the museum officials knew that they were the grandchildren of Stout. And they told that how this tile work, which is from 117 to 138 AD, this is a very old piece of tile, it's kind of posed on some pillars under there. And so Stout, just to show how specific and you know, very detailed he was, he had left instructions for how to clean this every year, and they were to hire 4 guys of equal weight, and they were to step onto it at the same time and scrub that down. I need that kind of procedures at my library. I'd have a cleaner library. So here he is, looking very dapper, I think. In 1970, he retired. And at age 77, here he is at this American Institute of Conservation meeting, which he had helped found that institute and also the International Institute for Conservation. He was highly respected just for being a museum person. His conservation colleagues were really surprised to find out what he had done. They really didn't know he'd had that colorful job. So he is like so many of the greatest generation. They came home, they just shut up about it, and they went on about their lives and their work. An interview of this other conservator, Dr. Stoner, she talked about him saying that Stout's typical operational mode was to generate major ideas and to plan his actions very precisely. He was a think tank. He looked at the big picture internationally. He saw what was needed, and then in his quiet way, he would cause that to happen. And she also said while he would not ever think of himself as a hero, he would get a lot of kick out of having George Clooney play him in a movie. Who wouldn't? So he died at the age of 80 in California. When he retired, then he moved out to California and died out there after some surgery. And here's his granddaughter. She's been to Winterset twice now. Like, I'm a friend, I'm a Facebook friend, and we've done a few things together. I was giving this presentation in Knoxville a couple of weeks back, and she wanted to go. They were making a cross-country trip, and she started, all this happens through text message, right? She started talking about, well, where is Knoxville? And I said, well, it's about an hour from Winterset. I said, well, we could knock their socks off and you guys could go with me. And she said, let's knock their socks off. And the family came with me to that presentation. It was great. So the 4 kids are theirs. The guy in the back middle is just a friend. And Rex Marks is police chief at Lincoln, California. And he also is involved in this Norwich University, which they all have on T-shirts of that. He's like director of programs. He's in charge of faculty relations. He's involved in the curriculum for that university. So he's a bi-coastal guy, and I guess he must be a type A personality to have that much going on. Or he must be strongly related to those Stouts or something. They like to do everything. Getting ready to get his PhD a year from July in Washington, D.C. So I don't know, he's a highly accomplished guy, very, very nice family. And the first time I asked them to Winterset, I thought, you're sticking your neck out. What if they get here, we just don't like them? What if they're real stuffed shirts or something? But they were wonderful. They were just like they were from Winterset or Iowa City or somewhere. They were just really nice people. So I want to just introduce you briefly to some of the other monuments men and women, and we'll start out with a woman. Gladys Hamlin, who was professor at ISU, our department, but before she was with the Roberts Commission, and she worked in the States during this period of time and wrote some little pamphlets as guides to conservation. And she left her archives there at ISU, so that's definitely on my to-do list to get up there, take a look at those. Maybe I'll get to see those little pamphlets that she made. Here's Walker Hancock. He's my favorite next to George Stout. I told you that I would say a little more about him. Sculptor from St. Louis, just happy-go-lucky, and the book The Monuments Men by Edsel has the letters from the fellows to their wives, several of the letters, and they're simply precious, so I really advise looking at those. Here are some of his sculptures. He liked to work in a large media. Here he is at an older age up here, working on the James Madison statue. And I think he has some wonderful quotes in his memoirs. He said, "The Greeks invented democracy and also began to carve images of ordinary mortals. These statues made heroes of them, and that, I believe, is still one of the worthy functions of sculpture, to honor our heroes." And then I also thought this was a cute little learning here that on this statue, they were having trouble getting it just situated down right where they wanted it, and being so heavy, and he put ice cubes under there so that he could just move that as they took the ropes out. They could get it just right down where they wanted it. That's for your Trivial Pursuits question. Yeah. So that was James Rorimer. He was a specialist in medieval art already before the war and director of the Cloisters Museum, and then went off to war. When he came back, he also was mid-career, in other words, and came back and became the Metropolitan Museum of Art director in New York City. Bulldog determination, willing to buck the system to get things done. And, I think of that movie, and they made it very clear that he worked hard for the trust of Rose Valland, and who could she trust? She couldn't trust French people, German people, friends, foes. She didn't know who she could trust. So So I'm sure that was quite the journey to get her to open up about her records and share those. Here he is at an older age on the left. Pretty nice surroundings where he worked too, huh? Here's Kirstein, the colorful Kirstein. He was high society in New York City, so he was rather nonplussed that he wasn't in the Army as an officer. He was a private. But he became, when he got back, the founding director of the New York City Ballet and had recruited George Balanchine to join him in that. Here's Posey, the guy with the toothache. Got a nice, sweet smile, but read the book and you'll find out that he's very military in nature at his task. He gets the job done. Private Harry Ettlinger. So anyway, here's a picture of him. Looks pretty much as he looks now. He's still alive. And he was born into a Jewish family in Germany. The family moved to the USA to get away from the persecution in 1938, just after his bar mitzvah. And is there a specific age of a bar mitzvah? Do you have that when you're 12 or 13? What did I do? Oh, you have that when you're 13. So yeah, when he was 13, they moved here, and by the age of 18, he had joined the military, so he was ready to go fight. And here's Harry. Notice the artwork in his home with a print of this, that he's saving the real thing in a salt mine. And this is one of those nice stories that just has a good ending, because as a kid, he lived in the town with the museum that held this, and I didn't look up what town that was. But he was unable to go into the museum, being a Jewish boy, so he wasn't able to get into that museum to ever see it. But he remembered that his granddad had this print somewhere while they were in Germany, and he contacted his family while he was there and was able to go get that out of storage and bring it back to the States, and he has it in his home. And so then from that particular piece of work, he also went to the Heilbronn mine, where he worked for almost a year. 40,000 cases of art moved out of that mine, and including the Strasbourg Cathedral stained glass windows. Oh, this had a good picture of the stained glass windows. I'm sorry, has anybody here been to the Strasbourg Cathedral and seen that? Well, those who have been there can testify that that's beautiful. So we're glad those stained glass windows are back. Dale Ford, I'm sorry about these slides being out of there. I'm going to have to go back through and check all my flash drives. So Dale Ford became the president of the Kendall College of Art and Design. And also in his memoirs, he revealed how there were some pretty tough conditions there. He had his Jeep shot out from under him on New Year's Eve, he said. Major Ronald Balfour, I apologize for this. This is the British fellow who was killed in action. And that happened in the German town of Cleve. He had already been an art history expert at Cambridge University. He was already mid-career when he came into the military, and he had been Stout's roommate, had a backbone of steel. So now you're going to have to read the book so you can see these pictures, and I really apologize for. And then here's an American man who also lost his life as a monuments man. 1904 to 1945, just 41 years old. Architect and design professor at University of Minnesota. So the whole thing makes you ask, should it be that to the victors belong the spoils? And I'm certainly grateful that Roosevelt and Churchill both said no, and that those Allied generals were capable of commanding their men in such a way that they could try to preserve as much art and history as they could and still win a war. Actually, it became very moving to me about just seeing how difficult it was to fight this war. Through all this reading that I was doing, I got all stuck on Eisenhower, and I went down to his boyhood home in Kansas just to pay my respects, I guess. But the more you read, the more you honor these people, I think, for the tremendous role they've had in our history. Well, and it brings up the importance of provenance. Who really has free and clear title? And if you've kept up with the newspapers, I'm sure you've all read about this Cornelius Gurlitt. His dad gave him all his art and said, protect this, don't ever let anybody see it. But he sold a piece now and again, so the police found his trail and tracked him down. And then today, well, there's an internet portal that if you have a friend who you think she has something in her attic that might not belong to her, you can tell her to look on this portal and she can find out. There are several organizations that are still working to return things to Jewish owners. And then, you know, the wars going on today, these International Committee and United States Committee of the Blue Shield are the ones who are trying to work on that. And our own Nancy Kraft is a member of, is she the head of the library? Head of the conservation section of the University of Iowa Libraries. And of course, having been through the flood, she is highly skilled at that at this point. And she joined the United States Committee of the Blue Shield. And after I found out about this, she sent me a picture on my cell phone of her with Harry Ettlinger. Way cool. Well, of course, there's more movies being made now, and I don't know if anybody's seen the one with Helen Mirren, Woman in Gold, Lady in Gold, Woman in Gold.
The book is called
Lady in Gold, and then the movie is Woman in Gold. Okay, well, I haven't not read the book or seen the movie yet, but it's on my list, my to-do list.
To the top.
I will, I'll put that to the top. So, Austria had her pictures, the pictures of her aunt, Adele Bloch-Bauer's niece, actually, had also, like Harry Ettlinger, had escaped Germany and moved to the States. And she literally fought her whole life to get these back, fought through the courts. And Austria said, well, this is like our Mona Lisa. They didn't want to let go of it. But she got them back. And she eventually sold them to Ronald Lauder in New York City for $325 million. Lauder being the Estee Lauder guy. And he evidently has a museum in New York City that is largely devoted to paintings that he's purchased that were unable to be given back to rightful owners. So, this is for your bucket list to go down to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. They're adding a section to open in late 2016 that will look like a salt mine. And this used to be my conclusion here at the top. The famous librarian of Madison County said that it was a remarkable moral decision in a world at war to save the world's historic and cultural treasures and give them back to the rightful owners. But I felt like, you know, James Rorimer had a better line. He has the very ending of his book. He says, at no time in history were so few charged with safekeeping so much. And then a Time correspondent said, they risked their lives to save a culture that preceded them by centuries, and because of their devotion will outlast them by centuries. And then I recently fell in love with this quote by Harry Truman. He was awarding the Congressional Gold Medals after World War II to some of the fellows. And in his speech, he said, they said we were soft, that we would not fight, that we could not win. We are not a warlike nation. We do not go to war for gain or for territory. We go to war for principles, and we produce young men like these. So I fell in love with that quote. And you made it through my presentation. I congratulate you.
You know, as people at home are watching this on TV, if you have a question, you have to use the microphone. And I'm going to start. Which is your favorite piece of saved artwork?
Oh my gosh.
Which is the one
that appeals to me?
Yeah.
That Klimt. I love that Woman in Gold thing. Of course, and that's not even the one that was saved. She had to really work towards getting that through the courts, but I just love that yellow Woman in Gold piece of Klimt. I like the modern art, and you know, they burned a lot of that, including a number of Picassos. It just makes you ill to think, you know, even if you went back, think of the creative effort that went into some of those Picassos. if you went back to him and said, which ones were burned, I wonder if he could even tell you,
And
you know?
there's the scene in the movie where they're finding all the empty frames and the ash on the ground, and they find the little brass plate from the frame, but the artwork is just
Gone.
ash.
Yeah. Well, Hitler thought that if you saw things and painted them with a green sky and, a green sky and a blue grass, that you should be obliterated from the face of the earth. So he did not like modern art. But I kind of like
Questions?
some of those
There's
modern
one.
things. Yes.
His name in the movie, was it George Stout?
No, it was
So
Frank Stokes.
why do you think they changed it?
I think they changed all the names so that they could actually make a movie because, let's say that they were trying to build a character and he smoked. And his family then would up and say, well, he never smoked or drank or cursed or something. And they just needed enough artistic license to actually make a movie. And like this French guy that was killed in the movie, there was no French guy in the Monuments Men. So they just kind of brought characters together and they said, okay, this is how we'll do it. And they renamed them. So I didn't like that at first because of my dear George Stout, but I guess it worked. And certainly the movie told this story, even though every detail wasn't accurate. I thought it was a good portrayal of the story. So what did you think? Were you upset by that or?
I don't know, I thought they should have kept the names.
Yeah, but then it would have been more like a documentary, and they couldn't include everything that would be in a documentary, So it was storytelling instead of a documentary.
So how did Mrs. Stout support herself when she lived in Iowa City? Do you know?
No,
No.
I don't know that. I'd be very interested if you could. Are your newspapers digitized?
Some of them are, but we've got the city directories of that time period, so we can find out where she lived, and maybe that
Oh.
will give us some information.
Yeah. Do find that out. I would love to find that out.
Yeah, we'll do that tomorrow.
Yay. Research done by others.
All right, anybody else? We did run a little long, but thank you all for coming, and help me thank Nancy one more time.
Oh, thanks.
So much.
Thanks a lot.